come back to it, which we're very excited about. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lee Becker. I'm the industry chair for the ACT-IAC CX Community of Interest. And as you know, our community of interest exists to bring government industry together around human-centered design, human-centered values. Frankly, how do we improve the experience and improving service delivery? Ultimately, this is what, right? How can we help advance how agencies transform? Ultimately, is how it delivers to the public and build trust with the public. Before we dive in, I want to flag an exciting upcoming opportunity. Our CX Summit is November 12th at the Carasoft in Reston, Virginia. It's free for government, small fee for industry members. Highly encourage you to mark your calendars and join us. It's as if you were there last year. It was incredible. Every year it gets better and better and better. This is going to be really great because we're also going to be really tying in further how CX and how CX and service delivery really drives the mission and really talking about various capabilities, talking about what does right look like. Also talk about what are some of the challenges that we can overcome. I think it's a great event that I highly recommend we should all sign up for. Ultimately, thank you for being part of this community. The energy you bring into these conversations, it's incredible. We've come a long way. I'm so excited, delighted that we have this event, our speakers with the recent executive order, with the Government Service Delivery Improvement Act, with the Veterans Experience Act of 2025, with IDEA. I mean, there's so much energy, and of course, the Section 280. So we'll hear more about it. So without further ado, I'd love to hand this over to Dominic Sale. Dominic, who's our program chair, and really appreciate your vision for you and the team of making this possible with our incredible guest. And without further ado, let's get this program going. Dominic?
Thank you so much, Lee. And I recognize we started a few minutes late, so I'll try to keep it quick. Thank you, Lee, for all your time and energy and leadership you brought to this community. It's great working with you. And good afternoon. Thank you to everyone, and welcome to today's ACT-IAC CX Community of Interest webinar. On August 21st, the administration released the executive order on improving our nation through better design. This is a landmark directive that seeks to improve experiences for Americans by breathing new life into the government's digital and physical touch points with its citizens. The order designates the first ever leader for design who reports directly to the White House Chief of Staff and is charged with creating a national design studio from scratch. For many of us in the government CX community, this was the first strong signal of this administration's commitment to designing government services for maximum responsiveness. Others have expressed some healthy skepticism at a time when deep cuts and rhetoric have seemed inconsistent with building a more empathetic government. Today, we have two exceptional speakers who will help us unpack the key provisions of this new order. Both are former colleagues, and I can personally attest to them being deeply committed to building more effective, more responsive government for all Americans. Matt Lira is Executive Director of Invest America. Matt was Special Assistant to the President on Innovation Policy during the first Trump administration, and he brings a wealth of experience in government innovation, design, and implementation, playing a key role in establishing GSA's Centers of Excellence and creating the first President's Management Agenda, codifying customer experience as a top federal priority. Amira Boland is Chief of Staff at New Practice Lab. Amira served as the first ever Chief Customer Experience Lead for the federal government from 2018 to 2024, crossing administration lines. Her experience as CX leader at GSA and OMB has led to the identification of high impact service providers and the development of agency reporting requirements for the advancement of CX. Last year, Amira was awarded the highly coveted Sammy Award for Management Excellence. And as she proudly touts on her LinkedIn profile, she's the winner of New Yorker's Deep State Oscar. Matt and Amira will delve into the nuances of this groundbreaking executive order, adding context from past CX activities and giving us a glimpse into what is yet to come. So I will chime in around 12:50 to take QA from the audience. Please put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to address as many as we can throughout. We encourage you to stick around after the session for another 30 minutes of what we're calling an off-the-record virtual mixer. And Matt and Amira hopefully will stick around for that. It'll be less formal and not recorded. And also, one final note to help us make our future programming as impactful as possible, we invite you to complete our brief survey after the event. The link will be in the chat and is displayed as a QR code at the end of the session. So now I'm happy to introduce my friends and our guests today. I'm going to fade into the background. Please join me in welcoming Matt and Amira.
Thanks so much, Tom, and Lee, too, for having us today. It's great to be in a community with so many familiar faces and friends, and of course Matt, who I'm so grateful to have had the privilege of work with and continue to learn from. And I'll start by sharing one of my favorite Matt moments, which was actually in 2018 when we were first spinning up the whole high impact service provider concept. And there was this hesitancy from agencies about publicly sharing operational performance data and feedback data. And Matt, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, but you said so bluntly, you said, we're not revealing anything by sharing this publicly. It's inherently publicly known. A person knows how long they waited for, they know whether or not they had a good experience. We're just showing that we know it too. So thank you for your championship in the early days to really help this movement build momentum. Obviously, this whole, kind of community and good service delivery started to build momentum following healthcare.gov and in the Obama administration and establishing the Presidential Innovation Fellows, which I know you worked on to get codified into law when you were on the Hill, to the establishment and growth of USDS. And then, of course, we did the first ever CX guidance and life experiences work and the Centers of Excellence work in the first Trump administration under your leadership, which helped many of us at the civil servant level continue to build on that during the Biden administration with the Customer Experience Executive Order, which stands today. And so now we have this new design executive order, which Dom mentioned, that builds off some of the things you personally were championing and trying to move at the end of the last Trump administration, and was hoping that you could kind of start by sharing more about how this EO builds on the efforts of the past decades and what you're excited about that's new and different with this executive order.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. First of all, for the introduction, and then for Lee and the entire ACT-IAC community for pulling this group together. I'm excited for today's discussion and hopefully to provide some information that's useful for folks as they're approaching the opportunity and the moment that we're in now. Effectively, as you teed up, Amira, CX as an issue area, particularly with the digital cross current, is something that has had building momentum for some time. I think each of the chapters of that journey that you identified had strengths and weaknesses, to include the chapter that I was most a part of. And that ideally, each step along the way represents an evolutionary step forward. And so specifically, as I look at this current iteration, the two things that I'm most excited about are, first, if you actually go into the EO text, it actually draws upon a lot of the policy work that had been occurring over the last 10 years, specifically name checks, for example, the US Web Design System and the 21st Century IDEA Act, and implicitly name checks, things like GSDIA and other legislation that creates authorities around CX and user experience more broadly. And so from that perspective, I think if it's successful, it presents an opportunity to actually effectuate the implementation of some of the policy changes that have been worked on for many years. The second is one of the things that I think I put this in my transition memo in 2021, which is that I feel like the Obama and Trump 1 administrations learned a great deal, but that ultimately heading into the current situation, I think the biggest opportunity is to scale those solutions, particularly what I would say is to scale them to the size of the problem. And the best way to do that is to create standards and toolkits and mechanisms with which the entire ecosystem, to include the career capabilities inside agencies, but of course to also include the vendor and private sector communities, to provide dramatically higher quality services that are not only higher quality but more consistent across these life events, I think, is, as you put it well in some of your earlier work. And so if you think about the core ingredients of the moment we're in, the first is the policy ingredient. 10 plus years ago, when you were approaching this problem, there were fairly significant policy gaps around elevating CX and design. Those gaps, I would argue, have largely been filled. And so they now are like, they're tools in the toolbox that can be used. The second is technological. There are things that are now turnkey commercial SaaS products that in 2017 didn't exist. And that creates this pretty incredible opportunity to deploy world-class services at a speed with which previously would have been impossible. And then the third is the identification of the problem set, which is why I'm particularly excited about the fact that the EO builds on sort of the high impact service provider work that I know you and others spearheaded, which is to say we need to work on the biggest possible problems that have the largest possible impact. It doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't niche problems that need attention, but it's a cliche in Silicon Valley, but it takes 90% of the energy to solve a small problem as a big problem. I think that's in my experience is true in government agencies as well. And so having the ability to combine the policy capabilities of the last 10 years with the modern technological solutions to the largest, most high impact problems in the government, I think presents a fairly tremendous opportunity. And we can unpack that over the course of the conversation.
Yeah, it's great. I remember someone at OMB had a Venn diagram on their wall that was policy, capacity, and leadership. And it was basically like you needed those three things for anything to be successful. And we were kind of missing all three of those for a while. And to your point, we sort of started to build them out a little bit. I was wondering,
absolutely.
Are there any particular services that you feel like, as you look at the kind of opportunity for people to feel this fast or feel the impact of the chief design officer or the national design service that this EO establishes, where you think there's like good opportunity for service innovation?
I think any of the high impact service providers present pretty meaningful opportunities. That isn't to say that progress hasn't been made in those areas. It certainly has been, but I think that there's two ways of approaching it. And the first, which is maybe the slightly more negative interpretation, but I think is warranted. And then the second, which is the optimistic side of that coin. So I think one of the challenges that we have is that we've been living in a world of exponential change. And we've largely offered, myself included, linear solutions. And so even as we've made progress against problem statements on a relative basis, compared to the pace of change, the situation gets worse over time. And so what's needed is a dramatic inflection point where the pace of your solutions and the pace of your change matches or exceeds, ideally, the pace of the overall change in society, particularly technological change. And I think that we have the opportunity to do that. And then the optimistic side of that, in many ways, is that rather than, I think in the past, most of these initiatives have been approached in the way that you would approach a pilot project. And so you've chosen, one or two initiatives to take on, to deliver a solution, to learn, what works and what doesn't work, and so on. But we're now over a decade into this community really having this renaissance of activity. And so in my view, the time for focusing in specifically on one or two projects, while sort of the other 90% of projects kind of just tut along, has passed. And that the real potential here is to create, well, one, to take the great work of the US web design system and to just refresh it and to up armor it. That will be a continual process. That's not a knock on the people who've worked on it to date. I think they've done a great job. But inherent in any system like that, you're going to constantly be refreshing it. And so you up armor the US web design system. You improve the toolkits that exist to implement that design system, both in government and then hopefully inside a broader ecosystem. And so that the design of these services can become, if not plug and play, any capability provider, whether they be an established legacy provider, a new entrant into the market, or a team inside an agency, would have the ability to effectuate the America by Design initiative. And that to me, so to answer your question, is I think that what's different about this approach, at least in its potential, is that it's focusing as much on the holistic standard and toolkit to effectuate that standard across all high impact service providers simultaneously, versus sort of focusing in on one or two areas.
Mhm.
But in terms of the areas that have great potential, just personal interest, I mean, you clearly look at things like recreation.gov or Medicare, or some of the things around the farm loan programs. But those are just ones that have personal interest to me. But clearly any of the high impact service providers would benefit from improvements. And if while doing those improvements, they can match a cohesive design system for the federal government, I think that creates, as benefits in terms of trust in those services, ease of use for end users, and so on. And the United Kingdom, in some ways, is a model for this.
Yeah.
And people will kind of come back at me when I use the UK as example, because they obviously are a smaller country in terms of the overall size of their programs. But nevertheless, like, the lesson can be drawn there that the use of there were teams that were focused on transforming individual projects, but there was also a team focused on this cohesive design system,
Yeah.
and to great success. And so to me, that's what this has the potential to be.
It's great because I think we had talked a lot about having a brand identity of the US government and across
Yeah.
services, and how you build that trust through those interactions. And, in Canada, the kids all grow up seeing the picture of the space arm in their textbooks that has the Canada logo on it. And it's the same
Right.
emblem that's on their tax form and on their bridges, and on, that really connects the dots
Exactly.
of like, this is my government at work and what my tax dollars are providing.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but that
Oh,
builds trust and familiarity,
yeah.
and especially in a world where you're worried about misinformation and and scams, and are getting more sophisticated. Anything you can do to increase the authority and trust in authentic systems, I think, is warranted. And uh, uh, in America, as we've talked about it before, in an analog world decades ago, we did this as a country. We had design initiatives that were successful and that will continue to benefit. I mean, the National Park Service is one that's sort of easy to appreciate, because you can go to any national park in the country. It has a cohesive design language, a cohesive user experience, and I'm thinking in the offline world. And so, updating that mentality for holistically for this, the world we live in today, I think has great potential.
Yeah, I appreciated when we talked with the Australian government around their kind of attack on improving service delivery. The very first place that they started was actually their physical environment. And they said that the first
Yeah.
thing we could just do and control actually more easily than all of the like rules about websites was just improving the service, the physical service center spaces. And I know that the EO mentioned that as well. I mean, that's obviously
Yeah.
hard because that's a lot of infrastructure investment too, but they even said,
Right.
like, even walking in and seeing plants or not chipped paint, it just
Yeah.
sets you up to have a shitty experience if you feel like you're in a shitty environment.
Yeah. Or just inconsistent, and you don't know, like, is this actually government, or is this I mean, we have the experience as non-UK citizens. One of our main touch points with England is Heathrow.
Yeah,
And you go
fantastic.
through Heathrow, it's fantastic. And to your
Yeah,
point, it's as simple as the logos are just the same, the fonts are the same, the design language is the same, sort of the
yeah,
dressings of the experience, but it's also design, capital D. Underneath the aesthetics, the workflow, and the how painless it is to go through their entry system, at least as a US citizen, is remarkable.
yeah.
End to
You
end.
can, I was gonna say, you contrast that to Dulles, where you show up, and I know one of the
Yeah.
mentionings in the EO was like reduction of duplicative services and investments. And we have a mobile passport control line, we have a global entry app line, a global entry line, and then
Right.
of course the like cattle call that is everybody else. And
Yeah,
so,
and that's just, and to your point, that's just for the US citizen, much less, as you said, our friends from around the world. So it's very, it's not a great look.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's, and it's easy, can be cheeky about it in some ways, but it's really meaningful. Particularly when it's services upon which, I mean, I always think about the fact that in the startup environment, if you treat your customers really poorly, startups will ultimately hold you accountable and attack
Yeah.
your market share. Government, we don't have that luxury, and so people get trapped in these broken systems. We all know this. If we're on this call, then you know that already. But um, and so it's there's a deep emotional resonance, I think, to helping people who ultimately depend on these systems and have nowhere else to go.
Yeah. And I love everything you're sharing and, believe deeply in all of that. I will share like some critics of the EO folk say that, suggest that the EO focuses unnecessarily on aesthetics and using like emphasis more on beautiful than
Yeah,
usable. And like the website that was launched didn't meet the US Web Design System standards
yeah,
and
yeah.
didn't have basic accessibility requirements. And so how would you respond to folks that are kind of saying that
Yeah, I
this is
think
about making things look nice rather than meaningful
yeah,
change?
I think on two levels. I think of the first part first and so on. So I think that especially in Washington, aesthetics can be viewed almost dismissively. Like you hear like, well, let's just make it pretty. There's a not afterthought. I mean, I heard that in a meeting on an unrelated issue as recently as last week, from a policy person. Like, well, someone else will make it pretty. And it's funny because you never hear that mentality from the world's best organizations, whether they be companies, universities, nonprofits. I'll name check them because I'm no longer in government, so I can now name check things. But you look at like Charity Water, which I think does incredible work in the nonprofit space. My personal view, and the whole experience is incredibly well designed, and it shows an intentionality about the underlying experience, which yes includes the aesthetic, but it's far deeper than
Yeah.
just updating the logo and shipping a brochure. I think capital D design, as I would say, is everything that you think about when you think about the holistic user experience, which of course includes the aesthetics, but the aesthetics are in service of the user experience ultimately, um, not the other way around. And so that's, I think, where the language of the EO comes from. And
Yeah.
then, the people involved, are people from that background. And so therefore, like that's the vocabulary upon which they draw. In terms of, microsite, I actually think there's a lesson in the microsite, which is one, I mean, um, I think at times we become like, I think at times in government, we can slow ourselves down in service um, of kind of compliance and standards and things which are very important. I myself have helped create some of those. But ultimately, to be successful, it needs to sort of be turnkey ready for everybody, to include its own microsite. And I think it's, as a statement of kind of 0 to 1, it almost serves as a symbol of the problem statement itself, in that we need to create the ecosystem, both the standards, the toolkit, and the ecosystem, where it is automatically compliant by virtue of the fact that it went through that process of being created. Whether that's a high profile website about broader initiative, or it's something that is kind of quasi anonymous deep down in the bellies of a larger organization. And the fact that it isn't automatic, that it isn't turnkey, to me shows the size of the opportunity that we have. I would rather have that than like, oh, we have this bespoke team that is able to meet these standards because they're building things out in a special way. I'd rather have an end state where the entire ecosystem is naturally in compliance with the standards, with the right toolkits and so on. We're not there yet, and so to that point, I think that the site actually serves as even a symbol of that challenge.
Yeah. Is there, as we think about the National Design Service that's being stood up, I'm wondering if you could share more about the vision of how you think that can and should work, as we think about like as it relates to, we often joked that we needed like an analog service, or that our
Yeah,
team was like an analog service with the US Digital Service. Because like so many times, so many of the problems are not like a tech problem, and it's this, as you said, like the bigger D design issues, and that kind of process engineering and things like that. And so wondered if your take on how the National Design Service should look as far as like talent makeup or what types of backgrounds they may have or what their like
Yeah, I mean,
engagement model should be.
yeah, National Design Studio, just a slight nuance
Studio,
there,
sorry.
which
Sorry.
I know you know.
Sorry.
The reason I highlighted is because it is sort of relevant to your question.
Yeah.
I don't think it is just intended to replicate the capabilities or the model that we saw and continue to see from other of these sort of innovation centers. I mean, they play an incredibly valuable role, and they should continue to play a valuable role, in their own ways. But I think one of the things that's been missing, and I came to this view during the first term, is modeled off of other experiments in the past, which well, like the Solarium initiative, is a place where you have genuine expertise, ideally at a world-class level, that has the political and political and policy authority to convene people, to catalyze projects, but also to be a place for collaboration and the development of momentum. And so and again, I'm not involved in the day-to-day, just to be clear, and so we'll see where things ultimately land. But what I think about the vision for something like the National Design Studio, it is a relatively small team of highly skilled expertise that is applied both to helping catalyze the evolution of those standards that we discussed earlier, in partnership with the appropriate stakeholders, but also as a convening point for initiatives across the HISPs. And so you would see a world in which every week one or two deputy secretaries or cabinet secretaries, they come in and talk about their initiative and their agency to get up to speed on this new standard. You kind of do that on a rolling basis. So therefore every agency is coming in roughly once every 6 weeks or so, and it just becomes this like catalytic function for driving these initiatives, in contrast to say earlier initiatives that would have said, well, we're going to take total ownership over this initiative and kind of land in your agency and make that change. And again, I think that's a capability that's needed. That's a capability we have. The gap is in how do you take that and scale it to the size of the problem. So
Right.
therefore, how do you do it in places where you're not going to be able to even administrations that put extensive amount of money into those initiatives were not ultimately able to scale to all 34 HIFs at the same time.
Right.
So you got to up level the entire ecosystem. And I think that's where I think the studio, I'm hopeful that's the role the studio will play.
It's kind of the physical convener of those initiatives and stuff.
The physical place, but also the political / policy place, and then the expertise, kind of all merged into one. And in the way that an MIT Media Lab or a Ridley Design Studio or places like that would help catalyze initiatives.
Yeah. It's a really it's a role that does not exist, and I think it's what a lot of our team had to kind of like haphazardly do in a way that wasn't like designated for that formally, or like have the resources to really do that. Like I think that's a lot of what we were trying to do with the life experiences model, and is like you needed to have those monthly steercos too, where you had like, because issues arise on projects and they can only be really tackled at the principal level sometimes, like where there's competing priorities of agencies against each other, where it's like the thing that is in the interest of the member of the public is not actually in the interest of any single agency, and so you kind of need to elevate it. And I appreciated that the head of the National Design Studio, or the chief design officer, reports to the White House Chief of Staff. We did that on purpose with the life experiences work, because we knew that it was like we needed to signal that sometimes there would be sort of someone having to make a call. And I was actually, this is just like a technical question, but it mentions the NDS administrator and a chief design officer. Are those the same people? Are they meant to be different people? Or
I think
how
they
does that
can
relate
be,
to GSDI official?
Yeah, they can be the same. Right now, they are the same person. They could be different if they wanted to, but at present, it's sort of the same person.
Got it. Okay.
Sort of dual-hatted. Yeah, but to get back to your earlier point as well, I think that's exactly right. Is because you've been in the trenches on this. I think a lot of people on this call have probably been on the trenches on this, and far too often, the biggest challenge on a project is how do I get attention onto this project?
Yeah.
And it's important work. It affects tens of millions of people, but it's not a bill going through Congress, or it's not an event that's on the schedule for next week. And so there is clearly a need for a place that is, this continual engine of political capital, lowercase p, of so it's not partisan, but it's a continual engine of political capital in an
Yeah.
organization for saying, like, both as a forcing function to say, if I'm the secretary, the dep secretary, hey, I'm going to the White House next week. I got some, we got to meet this deadline, which any of us have done PM on these projects is helpful to have. We simulated that, as you recall, in the Roosevelt room on an
Yeah, it
ad
was
hoc
great.
basis.
We
And I
copied
think,
that slide
yeah,
template from those Roosevelt room meetings that you ran for OAI,
yeah,
that was like so effective that a DepSec and their CIO basically had to come every month to
yeah,
provide an update to Matt and other White House leaders on tech initiatives they were working on. And that really helped the like va.gov refresh kind of cross the finish line.
yeah. I think, and
Um,
so having that structurally focused on this problem area, I think has
yeah,
tremendous potential. And then on the other side of that is sort of the show and tell, which is clearly something that senior leaders always love to do, and is to have the opportunity. So it's forcing function on one hand, but it's also a show and tell on the other, which is this great momentum engine. Because sometimes these changes, which affect millions of people, can happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't necessarily get felt by the senior leaders sitting in big fancy offices here in Washington. And so having a place where that work is encouraged, valued, appreciated, and tied into a cohesive strategy, I think has tremendous potential.
yeah, and I think as we think about the GSDI
Yeah,
Act,
and it's a clunky one.
and the CIO is which the designated official for GSDI is our federal CIO now. And
Yes.
obviously 21st Century Idea puts a lot of responsibility on the CIO as well. How do you see that person relating to the chief design officer?
Yeah, I think that one of the great things about maybe in contrast to even sort of my tenure in service is that it seems to be a fairly cohesive team inside the EOP campus at present. I'm sure there's some personality conflicts somewhere, but we had sort of epic intramural fights that were in the, you can read about online, in the papers all the time. I think there's a lot less of that today, if not zero. It's a lot less. And so my understanding is that they get along sort of famously, and it'll be cohesive relationship. They clearly have equities both with OMB, but also with GSA and with all these agencies.
Yeah.
And so, and given, we haven't talked yet about Joe, but given that it's Joe, I mean, he's not there to try to, take over turf on some sort of bureaucratic, long-term fight in a way that people who are going to be longer at the organizations are. So I think that frees up, I think that hopefully provides comfort level to people to be like, look, this isn't a turf grab thing. Even the National Design Studio itself and America by Design as an initiative have sunset dates in the EO. If they are viewed as valuable, they can always be continued. But we did the same with OAI in the sense that we're very purposefully not trying to create a new entity that's like permanently grabbing turf away from people.
Right.
And
Right.
therefore, I think with OAI that it was able to sort of lower the temperature, where I don't think, like, for example, the CIO's office ever felt like we were like permanently grabbing authority away that was never going to go back to OMB if we borrowed it for a day or two. And so, enables these partnerships to work really well.
Yeah. And I think we always joked that it was like so dependent on whether or not the DDM, the OMB director, the CIO, and the GSA administrator got along personally at any given moment,
Yes.
was like
Yeah.
how effective the technology
Totally.
apparatus in the US government was.
Unfortunately, yeah. Any organization, I mean, universities or companies that have the same,
Yeah.
interpersonal.
Like to the end of the GSA capacity piece, I think, and Joe actually, which it's great that you like think highly of him, and I've heard amazing things about his work too, and his like commitment to the outcome that he's there to deliver. Is like, do you feel like him being there in that role will help provide some weight behind, like, we can't not mention the fact that like a ton of design talent in particular, like the lab at OPM, at 18F, the first to go at USDS were all designers, right? And
Yeah.
and even at some agencies that are being allowed to hire now, they're being told they can only hire engineers. And we
Yeah.
just lost a lot of that capacity. And so how do you see like, do you think that he will be able to step up as a leader with weight to kind of rebuild some of that, or?
Yeah, I think, I think I would say two things. Well, I'll probably say more than two things, but I'll start with two. I encourage people to judge Joe for Joe, whether you end up being a fan or not a fan. I think it's helpful to sort of take a look at who he is and what he's done and what he does. And I would just encourage people in this community to sort of give him that fresh perspective. Versus if there's decisions you disagreed with, 3, 4, 5 months ago, I mean, that he wasn't a part of, I wouldn't necessarily place. It's fine for you to place that on maybe the whole administration if that's where you are, or if you love it, to champion it. But encourage people to just take him for who he is and the opportunity that it presents to have him entering public service in this way. In a lot of ways, he is sort of the dream candidate to lead this initiative. If any administration, going back to when I was transitioning in, talking with a lot of the Obama people, people like Joe were the kinds of people that even they were aspirationally,
Yeah.
thinking about. And so I think, having someone who's well-educated designer, but also, of course, his own personal experiences and his entrepreneurial journey, just imbue him with this like incredible sense of credibility. I think inherently gives like a tremendous amount of potential to the program and the initiative. And so, anyway, I'm very excited by that. I think, given his own professional journey, it gives him a lot of credibility on these issues inside the White House, in particular this White House, because he comes from a hospitality background,
Yeah.
which the president comes from a hospitality background in some ways. So there's like these overlaps that very few people could probably bring in that kind of capital, and I think that's incredibly exciting. And then the second piece of it is, I mean, look to what he's done in his career, but also even in the last 9 months. So, he was put in charge of helping to coordinate this retirement initiative. And there's still more work to do there, of course, like anywhere else. But it's, it hasn't really gotten a lot of attention. But if you look at the way he ran that project, it was something that, at least speaking for myself, I could get really excited about. The first thing was he looked at the landscape of, okay, what's the ideal end state, which is an end-to-end digital retirement process. Okay, what is the work that's been done already to help make that possible? Because we're obviously not the first people to show up and think about that. And he, very methodically met with senior career officials, external stakeholders, the vendors, and analyzed, okay, well, here's, where we are today, but here's also like these bamboo shoots of initiatives that, have been people been working on for months and years that just need maybe a little bit more water and could get us all the way there. And then the third is, I think, as important as building on the progress that came before him, it was done with a tone of respect for all these stakeholders I just mentioned. I mean, they put out a video it was earlier this year. I can't remember the exact timing, but it was like March, April, May, somewhere in that range. And, the video featured senior career officials, talking about their excitement for working on this initiative, talking about how meaningful it was to work on this collaborative team, to work against this goal that they can be really proud of personally. And to be totally blunt, like that stands in stark contrast to some of the other initiatives that we saw, that we've seen in the past, even in the recent past. And
Yeah.
so again, I think to me that makes me really optimistic about the kind of leader that he is and the approach that he brings to these kinds of problems, which is, yes, ambitious, and yes, says there's a sense of urgency about scaling, but ultimately, builds on what came before and seeks to build these collaborative teams that are a mix of, senior career officials, the vendor community, and yes, new talent that he's able to recruit in from the outside.
Mhm.
So if that's the approach, and I have every indication that that's the approach he's bringing to America by design, but if that is the approach that is ultimately effectuated, then I'm optimistic that a year from now, people who today may have questions, and then questions I myself understand why they have them, we'll look back and say, well, actually, that was a pivot point
Right.
upon which we really started seeing some of these solutions and cultural changes that people are going to be more comfortable with. But yeah, the proof's in the pudding. So that's my view based on what I've seen.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it's an important point. You mentioned the kind of integrated teams piece, and I think that was a big lesson over the last 10 years by USDS, PIFs, 18F, our team, like, is that, and I think we found the most success and we're able to actually deliver things with the life experiences when we were like, oh, you have a USDS product person and a agency policy person and a designer from the lab at OPM. And like, we were able to build these like integrated teams with a fresh IPA person, design researcher, that I know the EO specifically cited IPAs, which is great, a good way to bring in talent. But it's like, you kind of got to put that together so that you do have someone on the team that's like, wait, we have a USWS like banner that we could put on this new microsite so that we look like we're using the thing that we're doing.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I think especially when married with speed and agility, but that I think is where you get the most that's where the potential is, when you can build these diverse teams of people from different views, all sharing the same goal of moving quickly and scaling fast and working on the biggest order magnitude impacts. And then, of course, hopefully tied together inside a broader cohesive design system, as I mentioned earlier. So like you can just envision what that looks like.
Right.
And in a world where, again, rather than building these bespoke one-off solutions, which are great and helpful and useful, and I've done it myself, so I'm not like, I understand why you do it. But in a world where every project in the government over the long tail, every vendor in the government, every team in the government is ultimately building off this really robust ecosystem of both the standard and the toolkits that people can create around that standard. It's a tremendously exciting place to be in terms of the ultimate user experience.
Yeah,
And
because
so
I think,
I think that's the aspiration.
well, there's never been an administration as set up for success with like the things that it took, right? Like that were there when it started, as far as like to our point of like policy capacity and leadership. And I think that the thing that they may be able to add that's unique and different that we haven't had before is like the true leadership of like a West Wing owner that can drive this every day and have physical space to convene and all of those things. And
somebody, exactly. And somebody who can, I mean, we had, obviously Jared was the champion, and I know
that's true.
in the Obama administration, you had a few champions in the West Wing, but to your point, like having that matters a lot. And I think in giving it a structural role where it's not
the
even
policy framework to like execute on.
Yeah, well, both the policy framework, but I was going to say even the focus.
Right.
So even in our, even in the first term, where I think we had incredible support, particularly from Jared, in ways to like, help these programs. Like, it was still like, famously sort of one of many.
Had a lot of jobs. Yeah.
And so, having a person who's like, look, I am here to do this, and it's an ambitious initiative, but I also am reporting to the chief of staff. I have the ability to go into the Oval Office on a semi-regular basis. That is new, and hopefully it is something that continues as a model. I mean, no major company or organization in the world wouldn't have somebody reporting to the CEO who's responsible for their service experience or their product experience, except the US government. And so we have people who have that equity, but it's usually, as we've lamented, an equity among many other equities.
Right.
And versus somebody who's there every day saying, what about how this is actually going to work or not work? And you say like it's positioned for success. In some ways, I hope that's true for every administration going forward, in that, in 2029, it'll be like, well, the America by Design system was working, and so therefore it's better off than before. And then, what is it, 2033 after that, they would say it's better than it was in 29. So if this is actually going to work, it has to sort of be this flywheel approach. And there's a lot of forces behind that outside of government, just in terms of technological change, that are helping that along. But even within the government, structurally, I mean, my personal view is, ultimately this should be, a cabinet level position. I think we're a long way from that, but there should be somebody at that level who's saying, like, does this actually work well?
Yeah.
So we're closer to that than ever before.
Yeah. Well, and I hope too we'll be able to kind of we, didn't have the ideal capacity before, and so hopefully that will continue to grow too, and we'll continue
Yeah,
to
especially, sorry to interrupt. I know I've been,
no.
you get the gears turning. It's like especially, like, obviously you want these SEAL teams, so to speak, in government of the really talented folks, but if we can successfully cultivate this broader ecosystem, I think that would just be really transformative.
Mhm. I know we're at the 10:02 mark. Do we want to transition to questions, Dom? Are you gonna read through those or do you want-
Absolutely. Thank you, Amira.
Yeah.
So great discussion. It's hard to find a good, appropriate stopping point. I could listen to another hour easily. But we do have a lot of questions coming in, a lot of chatter in the meeting chat. I do want to remind folks of a couple things. One, there will be an open, like, off the record session at 1 o'clock, where if we can't address some of the questions here, we hopefully will be able to address them in a less formal environment in a few minutes. And then two is that neither of these folks speak for the current government administration. They're doing their best to answer questions openly and in the spirit of cooperation and building. So, none of the answers you're going to get today are going to be positions of this administration. I just want to make that clear up front. So I'm going to jump in and start with our first question. And this is really related to, I think this came up in your discussion about the loss of some of the resources that folks consider in alignment with this EO. So how will the administration reconcile the EO's goals with the recent loss of federal design and CX capacity, including cuts at USDS and 18F and across some of the HISP teams and some of the CX offices across government? I'll throw that out there for either of you to opine on and
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, look, I obviously would take a different approach based on the fact that I did take a different approach in 2017. That said, I think that there was a need for some of those organizations to be revitalized. Again, the way it was done is not necessarily, well, it isn't the way that I would have done it, but I do appreciate that there was a need to sort of revitalize some of the organizations. It's inherent in any large organization over time. There tends to be atrophication. Um, I do think that building back some of the capacities will be helpful, but ultimately, um, at the end of the day, I think that that only having that version of the solution is not sufficient to scale to the size of the problem, and it needs to be far more, cohesive standard across a much broader ecosystem. Again, that's not saying we don't need that capacity, and my own personal record will speak to my views on that. It's more than just like happy talk. Like, that's the decisions I made, was to protect and preserve and enhance that capacity, and I would make those decisions again. But I don't think that's mutually exclusive with saying, one, that there needs to be revitalization and an expansion of the toolkit to include that is not the whole solution. I don't think the people who created those organizations would think that either. And so what makes me excited again about Joe and the work he's doing is I think that represents one of the key missing pieces in that orbit. And hopefully it's a net balance positive.
Amira, you got any thoughts on this?
Oh, I mean, the capacity piece that I spoke to, I think two things. One is that to the extent that this effort is successful, is like it's going to need people to help implement, right? Like we found that's a thing that it takes to get some of these things off the ground. And so I think to Matt's point, like it was getting a bit like we needed to figure out some type of overarching tech strategy of like what capacity lives at agencies, what is the role of USDS, what is the role of 18F, what is the role of the different kind of platform teams at GSA as well, right? And so I think that needs like a deep like revitalization, I guess, as Matt used. But I also think that like it's going to be really hard to recruit talent into that environment right now when a lot of really great people left were fired. And like, what is the message or assurance we can give them? And I liked Matt's kind of like framing around Joe has a good track record of work, and the OPM project is a success to look at. And like he's sort of starting fresh here, and maybe that can help kind of carry a new energy and bring some folks in a way that feels like productive
Yeah, and it's not my place to make announcements for them, obviously, as you pointed out, Dom. But like, I will say, like the one of the infectious things about this work is that it draws people in, drawn all us in, because we know the impact it can have and what it feels like to work on something that helps millions of people. You know, because you sat down in a conference room or behind a computer for a few hours, a few months. It's a great feeling. And Joe has had, since the EO, like incredibly strong interest from what I would call like just world-class talent. I think when they start to roll out some of the names of the people who are signing up, even critics will be somewhat taken aback by the caliber of the people that are stepping forward. And there's a history of that in our country that continues. And I don't think that's, despite the recent turbulence, I don't think that has fundamentally changed.
All right, great. So we've got just a couple of minutes. I've probably time for one, maybe two more questions, but I'll make sure we cover the rest in the session afterwards for those who want to stick around. This one I really like. So what concrete metric should agencies be measured against in 1 to 2 years to show whether or not this EO is actually driving what it meant to drive?
Yeah, I'm very interested in Amira's thoughts on this, but because I know that's kind of your bailiwick in a way. But my view on this, to the anecdote that you started with, Amira, about the people in line know how long they're waiting in line, is that your metrics for success should be as aligned as possible with the ground truth of your end user, and that everything kind of works backward from there. And some of those things are compliance based, which are necessary, but I like those metrics less because those can at times be gamified versus sort of outcome based metrics. So the easiest would be just like broad scale adoption of the US web design system or something like that. And that's probably a component of the picture, but your ultimate end state should be, the actual user facing statistics, which, as Amir noted, I strongly believe should be far more transparent, even than it already is, to the public, so that what the net outcomes are for all the various programs.
I think, agencies have made a lot of progress in the last couple of years. There's still much to go around clarity of knowing what that metric is. Like,
Yeah,
to actually, like, for farm loans, is it like increasing application rate, or is it that more people actually who start the process get through? And what is our like coverage rate, right? Like, are the people who are eligible for a service enrolled in it? And so I think for each service that the NDS touches, it's like, is there a measurable improvement in the actual life of someone, as like to Matt said, as close to the ground truth of the people. We also have like, a lot of different, and I know the digital experience team at OMB has been working on building out like an ACT-IAC scorecard as well, to actually really tactically look at agency sites, and even like availability, like, is this form available on a mobile phone? Or is it just an electronic PDF? Or like, so I think there's a whole suite of measures in that piece too, that like, if NDS is solving problems at scale, like we'll see those measures increase as well. But I hope that they also prioritize and pick some measures that they want to hold themselves accountable to, because I think, and I've seen this across multiple different executive orders where, and quite frankly, I think this was a fault in the Biden administration, is like everything was a priority. And so there wasn't like clear focus, to Matt's point. And so I think they should pick 2 or 3 things that's like, we are going to integrate when you apply for your passport, you can also renew your global entry. We are going to make it so that when you submit your Medicare application, you get your digital ID. like at that time and don't have to wait 2 weeks for it to come to the mail, and then do those things and prove that you've done them, and then pick up the next round of 3 things. So I hope that they operate, and I think hopefully coming from a private sector mindset, they'll sort of be more focused on picking 3 things, delivering those things, and then moving on to the next one.
Yeah, if you give it, you may remember this line from the old days, but if you give an agency like 100 things to do, it's a menu from which they choose the things they're doing anyway. And so I think to your point, there's a real need for like focused leadership on whatever it might be. Uh, yeah, hopefully that can be catalyzed through the design studio.
Yep. Well, my quick answer is I hope it's trust. I hope it's increased
Oh,
trust
that's a good answer.
out of CX that comes out of the design. I think that's what it's all
And
about.
yeah,
That's what we
and I
need.
know we're trying to wrap, but Don, you just struck on it, which is like, again, this ground truth, because it's so easy to get lost in, whether it's compliance or something very tactile, which is obviously important. But at the end of the day, to your point, those are just means to an end. And the end is, did the service work? Do people trust and believe in our system of government and in our society? And if
Well,
we're not doing that, then what are we doing? I mean, great answer, Don.
well, I feel like having both of you here today helped build some trust with the community. I know you both have probably a little bit different perspectives, but I know this community is very much focused on trust at the end of the game, whether you're from the far right, far left, everywhere in between. We all want government to be better trusted, at least everyone here in this conversation. And so I really thank you both for joining us today. I think the almost 200 people who joined us, and I hope some of those will stick around and join the post discussion where I'll continue to go through some of these questions. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Amira. Thank you, everyone, for helping put this on and to join the part.